Hello, it's the Book Traveller here. Today I am in the Scottish city of Glasgow. Absolutely gorgeous day here. I've taken a walk out down the banks of the River Clyde, which is just in front of me over here. But I found this really lovely park, which is just kind of next to the river, but inside the city itself, full of all sorts of things of interest, various monuments, some old archways, one called the McLennan Archway just down to my right, some photos of that later perhaps. But the one behind me is to commemorate the Commonwealth Games that were held here in Glasgow in 2014 and is aptly named the colourful G, as you can maybe just make out the green G of Glasgow in there. But it's such a nice day. Thought this is a perfect place to take a seat and read the next instalment of the Sanctuary. We're now into book 3, which is titled Sea Change, and I'm going to start with you today with chapter 21. So, 10 days had passed since we had seen the elephant. There had been further wonders since, but that was the point at which I had finally realised how much more real this place was than the poor carnival of shadows that had preceded it. The mainland killed elephants. This blade made new ones. Spring had advanced in a rush. The sun pitched higher in the sky each day, and across the island life had surged from the earth with confidence of an invading horde. The conifers were lush, their branches heavy with deep greens, and the deciduous trees stretched towards the sun. The air was sweet with new scents and washed with torrents of bird-song. A line from an old play, or perhaps a poem, kept recurring to me. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises. I couldn't remember where it was from. The works of the mainland had faded in importance by now, but it felt true. It had rained for 3 days a week ago, yet the paths underfoot had stayed well drained, and we had been warm and dry within our homes. Everything was for the best, and the world was grown new again. It was hard to remember the cramped, aging mainland without a shudder. I remembered how I had thought of the world's future could only be secured by the millions of people in my country and the countless millions more around the world. It was embarrassing, now that I had seen it, what a few thousand could do with determination and true leadership. My mornings were spent painting John. My hand had recovered fully, meaning I could accompany Francis in the fields once the day's sitting was over. I'd been to the polytunnels, where you felt nourished simply by breathing in the scent of 100 different species. Some afternoons I would wander the island, introduce myself to a different hex each day, and learn whatever I could. I felt like the reverse of Mad Thomas. Where he had found pain and suspicion, I had seen the good written through this place. After dinner, several times a week, I would sit with John and his companions. Not that that mattered. I would often be invited to a gathering at John's lodge. I laughed sometimes, thinking of my cramped home back in the city compared with the life I led now. All I needed was Kara, and John had assured me several times that her work on the mainland estate was almost complete. There were still 5 days until the island's closure. She would be back in time. I had not told him what Bianca had told me, but John seemed far more reliable on this matter. I worried, of course, but I had faith too. What is faith if accompanied by doubt? I had mapped almost the whole island now, barring the tangled corner of the southeast that held the biological vaults, where naturally strict protocols applied. I was luckier than most of the workers. I had more time free to myself to make myself useful or increase my knowledge of the place. In this, I seemed to have John's tacit approval. My main work, the painting, was nearly its final stages. In the sessions out of them as I woke and before I slept at night, it was the only thing I cared about. I had felt more purpose, more creative spirit in a few weeks here than in 10 years on the mainland. Finally, I was carrying out the labour I was meant to fulfill. John was sitting forward in the portrait, his hands before him, fingers interlocked. He wanted a pose that suggested energy, potential. Now, so many of my previous pictures seemed dull in comparison. Those families with their perfect lives, their dogs. He had asked to see some of them, and I had shown him a few. He had not said anything critical, but I had blushed as he surveyed their flatness, their lack of life. This, however, John's was a portrait where energy and truth jostled in equal measure, a picture that would inspire its viewers with the dynamism of the man it showed. The base layers were long, complete, the background painted in a single ivory column from his bedroom, mirroring his strength and solitude, and the clothes and hands were finished too. I was building up the layers of the face slowly, but I was struggling. How could one depict energy like this in a still image? Some mornings I doubted whether the entire medium could contain him. To be painting a man like John in such close proximity. And of course, in solitude, was giddiness sometimes. He was like a young morning star, a bringer of light, and he exerted an almost physical pull on everything and everyone around him. It was evident at dinners, or when I accompanied him on journeys around the island. His people wanted to be near him. When he and I were alone together, I felt a curious power, as though I had temporarily borrowed some of his gravity. Approaching the canvas, standing at his right hand, was invigorating and terrifying every time. John himself did little to alleviate the difficulties in my work. Painting him was like depicting a landscape in all four seasons at once. My former clients had usually arranged their features into whatever shape they thought made them look best. John's own emotional state each day encompassed the pensive, swaggering, thunderous, humble, solemn, bombastic, and dozens more. Perhaps an outsider observer would say his expression looked like the same from one day to the next, but I could tell the different states within him. I told him sometimes I felt I had to paint a crowd, and he snorted and told me it wasn't his fault I couldn't hit a moving target. The whole island had a feeling of expectancy. In the wake of John's announcement, a few residents had left with our good wishes, but once they had gone, we who remained had acknowledged that we had never been entirely sure about them. When the small party of leavers had departed by boat, a modest ceremony was held at the harbour. The rest of us had surveyed each other with excitement. We were the remaining crew of the ship of stone, and we would guide its course through the months and years ahead. This approaching change in direction, this moment of embarkation, gave each day on the island a frisson. Each night at dinner, John announced how many days remained, and we all applauded the progress. There was an extra pressure in the air, the kind the city felt before a riot, but benign, of course, wholly benign. John felt it too, and called it the electrical charge of the future, calling us toward it. The practicalities were being dealt with now. There were a few final consignments of goods to arrive, mostly raw materials the island lacked in sufficient quantities, but they would be here in a day or two. Some of us had heard that the mouth of the tunnel was being fitted with explosives to be detonated on the day of closure. The stone umbilical would be severed at last, leaving us free. Kara would be back in time for that. I had to keep reminding myself, and we would watch it together. Two people, alone, remained curious bruises in this place. Angela Knight had lost status, even in the short time since I had arrived here. Her look at the dinner table most evenings was abstracted, as if she was striving to remember something just beyond her memory. She was out of favour and clearly felt it. When John spoke to her to cajole her, she livened immediately, but as soon as the beam of his attention slid off her, she lapsed again into a torpor veined with bitterness. Our dinners were not seriously inhibited by this. She had never contributed much in any case, but it was enough to cast a slim, mournful veil over otherwise cheerful proceedings. Occasionally John lost his temper with her, justifiably, in my opinion. Bianca Pemberley had worn a similar air of sorrow these last weeks, although we still had enjoyable conversations at dinner. It was clear to me that John had been right. She was somehow damaged beyond repair. I had less time to spend with her. Of course, she'd given the demands of my work, but I worried for her. She had picked up a habit of breaking off from the conversation and looking down at her lap. If you were next to her, you would hear her crooning gently, blocking out the world. I was concerned about her, not least because of the terrible effect her behaviour must be having on John. She and Knight were two of the three people closest to him, had been, at least before I arrived, and their inability to enjoy life here after all, his work, must have weighed heavily on him. When possible, I cheered her up, and in just this last fortnight I suspected I had become one of the people here she trusted most. John and I talked a great deal in our painting sessions. Sometimes I would pause my work for minutes on end while we spoke, then feel the time escaping and reluctantly ask for silence for the next few brushstrokes. We talked about everything, the extinctions on the mainland, the vault of life, how the island's climate would shift in the decades to come. I asked after the elephant too, and John told me it had been transported to the mainland. Soon it would be taken onwards to a more suitable environment in one of his substantial overseas estates. More would be created to follow it, he said, although he refused to reveal how the work had been done, taking refuge in the idea of himself as the island's resident magician. We even And this is when I knew I had truly gained his confidence. Spoke a little about his early life. It had begun with shared reminiscences of school, of which buildings had changed, and when I mentioned my own family, he listened with patience, trusting I was not soliciting information about his own. Occasionally, he seemed to suggest that his parents had been in law, or business, or perhaps politics. None would explain his extraordinary wealth, of course, but I guessed he had inherited a small amount and done the rest on his own. And I felt curious still. I had to remind myself to be satisfied with the completed man before me. We spoke about the world outside, too. John received digests from his offices on the mainland and would disseminate the relevant parts to us. I had not appreciated before what a burden it had been back there, being caught in a drift of news, a fresh trough of mud to wade through each morning. Here we had the perspective of distance and saw the world for what it was, a distraction from our work. I was moving from my position at the canvas right by John to my spot a few meters away to get the perspective for my next strokes, when I thought to say it. May I ask? I did not know how to put this, given the argument during our first ever conversation. I know this is nothing like a prepper's home, but is it partly designed to carry things forward if it all goes wrong elsewhere? Well, you could put it that way. I was abashed to say what I said next, fearing laughter or freezing silence. Like an ark. But he was gentle in his reply. That's one way of thinking of it, Ben, and I see why you think that. We have several thousand species here, and that are now found almost nowhere else, thanks to Angela's work and of course to Kara's great efforts too. He paused, but it does nobody any good to think of it that way. If the people here knew the weight of the burden they carry, protecting so many possible futures, they might not be able to stand it. Why tell me then? Because you are one of the people who will take this place forward, Ben. By helping Kara, once she's returned, of course. You must see that. I had thought of it before, imagined I was being prepared for a greater role here at various points over the last week, but to hear John say it now brought a great warm feeling to my face, my chest, the palms of my hands. He carried on. She has practical skills, and you have the vision to support her, and you had a wonderful anger in you when you came here, because you thought I'd made the mainland what it was. I looked down at my palette, embarrassed. Yes, that's all right, Ben. I understand it. You wanted to change. But the mainland will always be like that. We'll never change its rules. So I'm making new ones here. And you and Kara have the courage and the youth to carry it forward. But you're not going anywhere, are you? Of course not. And I hesitated to ask my next question, knowing how private he could be, but I thought I was secure enough to take the risk. Why not Bianca? He sighed, moved his shoulders. Expected inheritance rarely works. You know the idea of the novus homo. The new man. He nodded, and I felt relief. Someone who goes into a field of untainted by a family history within it, not receiving advantage. Exactly. Look at the leaders who tried to create something new, then rode back and handed over to their children. Napoleon, Cromwell, 100 dictators. It never worked. Why not? Because their children were expecting to inherit. Exactly. They may have had the raw material, but they never had the chance to create themselves first. I love Bianca very dearly, but she carries too much of her mother, and her expectations have warped her too far. You have noticed her frailties, I'm sure. The conversation lapsed, and I painted in silence for a few more minutes until the close of the session. That afternoon, I sat in the studio at the cottage, trying to understand what John had told me. He had as good as confirmed me and Kara as his heirs here. It seemed fabulous, although of course it would not be relevant for many years to come. And yet, when I looked at it again, why should we not be? Kara had the skills, as he said. I was temperamentally suited to help her in his judgment. It made perfect sense. My reflections were interrupted by a knock from behind the cottage. Francis and Joanna were both out, him in the fields, her in the island's kitchens. So I left the studio and opened the door. Beneath the porch, dark-eyed and shivering, stood Bianca Pemberley. Well, end of chapter 21. Let's quickly move on to chapter 22. Catch me in the next one.